I'm Eric, and this is Yeti Garage. And today, I'm going to be working on this Ford 9-inch. I'm going to put this in my Bel Air. First, I have to make it fit. It's too wide. Of course, it still has all the factory brackets on from whatever Ford vehicle it came out of. So I'm going to start with pulling the brakes, the center section, axle shafts, and then cutting all these brackets off and grinding down this tube. So let's get started. First thing I'm going to do is pull the axle shaft. This is the end of the axle shaft here. It's held in, not enough light to see in there, but there's 4 bolts that go through the flange on the end of the axle, through the brake backing plate, and then there's a retainer plate that holds the axle in by holding the bearing that's pressed onto the axle. So there's nuts, and you access those nuts through the large hole. Let me get better light. Large hole in the end of the axle shaft. So this axle, I'm not sure if they're all 9/16, but this one takes a 9/16 socket. And you just spin this around until it lines up. That's it. Do that 4 times. And then this axle will pull out. And at the same time, the brakes should fall off the whole backing plate. As an assembly, everything will stay on the, well, if you're careful, all the shoes and everything should stay on the plate. Alright, so I got the axle shaft and the brakes off of the housing. Forgot to mention a couple things. First, don't assume that anyone ever drained the oil out of the axle just because it's been sitting around 20 years. Apparently, they can still have oil, and then it still makes a big mess on the floor when you pull the axle shaft out. Second is the backing plate. I left this one on. Also has a brake line and emergency brake cable hooked to it. I just cut the brake line because this is going back together with disc brakes. I won't be using any of that, but if you wanted to reuse it, you just use a wrench, loosen, well, you can't even see it in there, it's dirt. Use a wrench, loosen this end. It's the little flared end on the end of the brake line. All right, next I'm gonna pull the carrier. Loosen all these nuts. There's studs into the housing. That carrier will pull out the front. You have to take the axle shafts out first before the carrier will pull out. I rolled the axle up so I could get a socket on these studs. This is 9/16, so also the socket. Remove all these nuts, and this carrier is going to pull out of this housing. What I wanted to show you was that there's these bottom 2 right here, and then as you can see, you cannot get, well, I mean, maybe with enough wobblies and all kinds of stuff, you could get a socket on there, but for the most part, you can't get a socket on them. The reason I mention that is if you can get the socket on the bottom 2 studs on your rear end, you have an 8-inch, not a 9-inch. So when you're out hunting for a 9-inch, that's a quick way to identify it, is to see if this casting sticks out past these studs. The pinion will be mounted up higher in the casting on an 8-inch, allowing enough room to get a socket on those studs. Got the carrier out. This guy definitely got his money out of this oil. I don't know if you can see on the camera. It's just a burnt, chunky, gross mess in there. So I think it's time for a bath before we go any further. I don't really want to deal with this. I degreased and pressure washed this thing a couple times, and it's still dirty. And now I'm out of degreaser. So I have to go in town and get some more. I also cut the brackets off with a torch. There's all the brackets there were. And I started grinding them down. Get this thing all cleaned up so we can weld some new brackets to it. Make it fit under this car. The 9-inch housing's outside, soaking in degreaser. I pulled the factory, this is the factory rear end out of that Bel Air, out, got it up here. I'm going to use all the brackets off of this rear end on the 9-inch to mount it under this car. So like this bracket is for the upper control arm, it's panhard bar, lower control arm brackets. I'm going to cut them off of here, clean them up, weld them onto that rear end. To do that, I need the brackets cut off cleanly, and I need numbers to measure off of. So I started with this, found the center of the rear end between the backing plates. So this is the half of the distance between the backing plates. On this rear end, that's the same as the center of the pinion. Some rear ends, that'd be the center of the housing where the stud is. The new rear end, the 9-inch, I'm going to set up where the pinion, everything's measured off of the pinion being the center. Because I'm going to build this car so low, I'm worried that if that pinion's not centered, the driveline could hit the tunnel by having that offset in the driveline. So first step, I got to get all these control arms, panhard bar, brake lines out of my way. Then I got to find all the measurements for the brackets off of center line, write all those down. And then I also need to find all my angles. So I'll set this carrier, the line of where the carrier meets the housing at 90 degrees. And then I'll find all the degrees. So if this one's, let's say it's a 45, and this one's whatever, 10 degrees, I'll write all those down. So when I'm welding everything to the other rear end, I have something to measure. So I got a bunch of stuff stripped off of this and all the measurements I need. Now I'm ready to start cutting all the brackets. I think I'm going to have to use a bunch of different things. I'm going to use a grinder on some of it, a torch if I can't get the grinder in there. I guess I'll show you as I figure it out. I know I don't want to tear them up, so I have to go slow and see what works. So I ended up using a cutoff wheel on the grinder to cut along the axle on every bracket. And then when I started trying to cut on the radius, I couldn't hardly get that cutoff wheel in anywhere. I was fighting it, so I just grabbed the torch and scalped her as close as I could. Probably wouldn't want to do that if you're going to reuse this axle because it gouged it in a couple spots, or I gouged it in a couple spots. But this is going to the scrap yard, so I don't really care. I took the brackets and cleaned them up. Definitely usable. I finally got the inside of this housing. So I need to get some good light in here. Relatively clean. Clean enough. And then the outside of the housing I wire wheeled it, and then been using these bristle disc by 3M. Does a pretty good job of sanding this down. Doesn't remove any metal, so I don't have to worry about sanding anywhere, grinding anywhere too thin or anything. It doesn't take any metal off. So now I got my marks on here. Oh, it's too reflective to see anything. There we go. That mark is the center of the stamped housing. So this stamped piece from this weld to this weld. That mark is the center of that housing. This overall axle housing is built where the center from flange, mounting flange, to mounting flange is also the center of this stamped housing. There. It's a 4 9-inch, so it's 15/16 offset for the pinion, which is where I put this mark. And I'm measuring off of this mark for the layout for all the brackets. So this will be the new center of the housing, or the overall completed axle. I'm only able to do this because I'm narrowing this axle. So after I put all these brackets on, I'm going to cut these tube ends off, and I got to shorten it about 4 inches overall, so it'll be like a 1.5 inches on one side and 2.5 inches on the other side. I take off to recenter that housing. If you weren't narrowing the housing, you can't really move your center line around. But this axle is wider than I need for this car, and while I'm at it, I have these GM style ends for it, so that I have some disc brakes off like 98 Camaro. So I put this end on there, I can run those disc brakes, which gets me an e-brake, mainly because this is a manual car and it's going to be a 6-speed in it, so I really want an e-brake. And then it gets me disc in the rear, 12-inch disc. But for right now, I'm ready to start welding brackets to this housing. So I'll show you once I have everything tacked up. Okay, so I got all the brackets tacked on and checked and rechecked, and I think everything's right. And then while I was at it, on the shelf I still had a bung from an old project, and I decided to put a drain in this housing in case maybe someday I feel ambitious and want to change the fluid. So let's weld this in to the bottom, and then I'll just put a plug in it. But I'm gonna weld it out and then put a little spray paint on it, because I think it's going to be sitting a couple weeks before I get around to shortening it or narrowing it. Oh, it's all welded out. I'm going to spray a little paint on it now so it doesn't rust. Well, here it is, all painted. I didn't paint the ends because I'm going to cut those off. In the next video, I'm going to build an alignment jig and narrow this rear end, put those GM flanges on the end of it. Alright, that's it for now. Thanks for watching.